Hello, and welcome to the Semper Colloquia. This is an ongoing series of informal afternoon discussions where a distinguished guest speaker takes us into their area of research. My name is Micah Dubroy. I'm the editorial lead here at Semper, and with us today is Mark Fisher, who's here to discuss the use and abuse of ancient texts in modern politics. Mark is assistant professor of government at Georgetown University. His research focuses primarily on ancient Greek political thought, but he teaches more broadly in the history of political thought and historical methodology. Welcome, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
Yeah. So I want to jump right into the issue that's sparking this broader question. So if you're someone who's been following foreign policy debates over the last few years, especially concerning the relationship between the US and China, there's an idea you may have heard of called the Thucydides Trap. And so maybe, Mark, you could start us off by telling us a little about sort of what that idea is, how it came to have political relevance in the 21st century, in America at least, and how sort of what may have began as a rhetorical move, a deft rhetorical move in a book, in a scholarly book, may have sort of unintentionally increased the possibility of conflict between the US and China. Which is a large consequence to any scholarly work.
It's a big claim. It's not often that we get to say that misreadings of ancient texts may start wars, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
So the Thucydides Trap has been something that has really kind of came on the radar in sort of about 2015 or so. People began talking about it. President Obama, Xi Jinping actually was tweeting about it. And more or less, the argument is one about the inevitability of war between the US and China. And somewhat bizarrely, people have decided to frame this issue about the inevitability of war with China in terms of Thucydides' articulation of why war occurred between ancient Athens and ancient Sparta. And the claim is that if you go back to Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, you can find this theory that whenever you have a hegemonic power, and then you have another power that's kind of rising up and challenging that power, war between the two is inevitable. This had already sort of generated some buzz in foreign policy circles when Graham Allison, who's a professor at Harvard, published a paper in The Atlantic and then eventually published a book that really thrust this into the forefront of some American political discourse. Trump really latched onto this, and in 2017 or so, people began talking about this quite a lot. So Graham Allison, in the end, was really trying to argue against the inevitability of war, and was trying to, in some ways, suggest that the Thucydides Trap was real but not inevitable. And so he wrote this book called Destined for War, and he tried to argue that, first on empirical grounds, there were about 16 cases that he was able to look at, and not all of them had ended in war. It was something like 12 or 13 of these had led to war, and that there were certain incidents in which they didn't lead to war. And so we could try to figure out what was different about those cases. And then he was also trying to suggest that there were complex social, cultural, historical factors that might help us to deter war in the case of China and the US. Now, Graham Allison sold a lot of books, and this made a lot of press. But I think you referred to the fact that this might have had some unintended consequences of actually making war more likely. I think if we do go to war with China, it's unlikely that we will blame it on Graham Allison. But there is a way in which he posed the question, I think, in an unproductive fashion. He did suggest that the sort of thesis to be defeated was supposedly Thucydides' thesis, which was that war was inevitable. And then he set out to defeat it. But the sort of unintended consequence here is that he kind of all of a sudden puts the burden of proof on himself to disprove the thesis that war would be inevitable, when no one really was suggesting that it was inevitable in the first place. And so all of a sudden, if he doesn't convince you, you're left with the thought that, oh no, war is inevitable, which is unfortunate, right? Because the more we think that war is inevitable, the more likely we are to actually make it inevitable. But also it's a kind of I think, a misreading of Thucydides, because it is true that Thucydides suggests that there were certain factors in Sparta and Athens that made war between these two powers inevitable. But he doesn't present it as a generalized theory about all political agents or political actors. He does suggest that the Peloponnesian War might be used as a paradigm for later historical cases. But I think he would have been very skeptical of the way in which we're assuming that we can use it or use it to identify a theory that must or would be applicable to the 21st century.
Yeah, that he probably wouldn't have thought too much about its specific consequences that much farther down the road. There's maybe a sort of a spectrum of questions we can ask here. One would be to zero in on Thucydides himself and think about how we should really think about him. There's probably a whole set of geopolitical questions about U.S. and China relations.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll leave aside generally for the moment. And then maybe a broader question too that comes back to sort of the title of the colloquia about how we should really think about approaching ancient texts in general, maybe with this as a specific example. So maybe we could start with the first one about Thucydides himself to get a sense of what's really going on here and why this example maybe has run off the rails. Who was he? What did he do? Tell us about Thucydides.
Sure. It is funny that Thucydides is one of these figures who is extremely popular among those who study this professionally, policymakers, historians, but has really no reach beyond the academy. So people have heard of Plato, they've heard of Aristotle, but they've not necessarily heard of Thucydides. And actually, there was a comic while I was writing my PhD that I love to reference, which the comic just said, "Thucydides has never heard of you either." And I used to love referencing this whenever someone asked me who he was. He was a general in the Athenian army who fought in the Peloponnesian War. And so his first kind of experience in this was direct and quite practical. But he lost a battle and was exiled from Athens. And so though he had decided that he was going to write the history of this war from the outset, or so he tells us, once he was exiled, he kind of allows this to take over his entire intellectual life. And the one benefit of being exiled was he now had access to both sides. And so he set about this kind of ambitious intellectual project of accounting for the Peloponnesian War and trying to give an impartial take on what was going on. Now, this doesn't sound that exciting, except that a lot of people kind of credit this text with the birth of modern historical writing, the birth of international relations theory, and even the birth of political science in general. And the reason that they do so is Thucydides was pretty much the first thinker to focus only on natural, secular, causal processes. And so he develops a rigorous way of accounting for time and chronology, and he dismisses any conception of supernatural causation, and he tries to make sense of the war simply according to what people did and what the underlying kind of power structures were that were conditioning people's behavior. And so, people see him as thousands of years ahead of his time. And not just that, but when modern disciplines of history and political science came to be created, they self-consciously did it by reflecting on Thucydides. So the modern practice of history starts in Germany in the 19th century by this guy named Leopold von Ranke. And he wrote his dissertation on Thucydides, explicitly Thucydidean in his approach. Similarly, the invention of international relations in the early 20th century was done by people who were reflecting on the Thucydidean project. So even though he flies under the radar, he has been incredibly consequential in constructing the intellectual world that we now inhabit, and that kind of helps, especially people who are in positions to make policy, think about how they want to make that policy.
Wow. And so speaking of policymakers, was Thucydides sort of present not just for people within sort of academia, but in politics and sort of speech making themselves before sort of Allison reintroduced him.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is thought to have been loosely modeled on this speech in Thucydides. So Thucydides writes something called the funeral oration. That's Pericles' funeral oration. And Lincoln was supposed to have kind of pretty much had that on his desk and used it as a model. But even beyond this, I mean, like in World War I, they had printed paperback copies of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and you found British soldiers on the front who had a paperback copy of Thucydides in their back pocket. So as they're sitting in the trenches and waiting for things to go, they're reading through about the Peloponnesian War. And there's a lot of other things. Colin Powell had we had a quote that was attributed to Thucydides on his wall, but it was actually not a quote. It's
Speaking of
just
abuse,
as much as people love Thucydides, they also love attributing quotes to Thucydides.
Mhm.
It's an incredibly common practice. And there's actually an account on Twitter run by this incredibly esteemed professor of the reception of Thucydides that just goes through and corrects people's misappropriations of Thucydides. But also he appears in Wonder Woman, which is just quite bizarre, in a misappropriation. So Wonder Woman is talking to her enemy, and apparently he comes up and I forget what exactly the quote is, but says something, and she goes, Thucydides, and there's this moment where they like mutually, have this moment of mutual respect because they've both misunderstood or misquoted Thucydides. So there's a weird way in which he actually has taken on this kind of level of authority that's independent of actually what he wrote, but his name himself is used as a symbol for some kind of intellectual gravity and kind of enduring wisdom.
That's very. I'll have to rewatch Wonder Woman and look for that. That must be very frustrating, I imagine.
It was at first. Now I kind of enjoy it. I find it pretty funny. I have on my office wall here, I actually have a framed picture of an advertisement for a bank in the immediate aftermath of World War II, which begins with a quote from Thucydides, and basically says Thucydides knew, and you're supposed to read into it, and ultimately it's trying to get you to buy bonds in this bank, and it's attributing whatever it's selling to the timeless wisdom of Thucydides. And I find it pretty hilarious. But I do think it is a kind of helpful warning in some ways, because Thucydides' text is in some ways so open and so rich that it's really easy for a wide range of people to see different things in it. And I think it's a helpful warning that we may too, even though we're scholars and we're reading it in Greek and all this, we may too be going to this text and kind of taking what we want from it. And it's a good warning to sort of try to take a step back and make sure we're not plundering the text quite in the way that these other people have been.
Yeah, so I feel like that's the sort of culmination I want to ask you about how to really do that and be careful in that way. Before we get there, though, sort of talking about your office door and the context you're in right now, you're in the political science department at Georgetown, and I don't know specifically how the department is arranged, but my understanding of political science is you're doing political theory and reading Thucydides and other ancient writers, and the person next to you in the office, down the hall might be doing sort of statistical analysis of sort of modern polling practices or something.
Right.
But broad, I don't know if it's a divide or sort of set of interests within political science. And I'm curious, one, and this is just sort of maybe a big picture question, how, sort of how you think about the connection of those things, and maybe how Thucydides might have maybe reflected a similar type of divide himself.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We have the assumption that academic departments have been created with some master plan, and really they're kind of historical artifacts of bizarre fights over, between people in the university administration. Luckily, I think Georgetown's an incredibly functional and healthy department, but it's true, we cover a really wide range of things. So people doing international relations, constitutional law, statistical analysis of comparative political systems, and political theorists, right? And political theorists both do kind of straight philosophical work, trying to conceptualize justice or conceptualize rights. And then they also do historical work. So they think about how the concepts that we use, justice and rights, have developed over time, and how particular developments have been constructed in response to very specific questions that arose in often societies that are very different from ours. There is, unfortunately, I think historically, a bit of a schism between those who are doing empirical work and those who are doing theoretical work. And I think people on both sides lament this and really think that we need to work more closely with one another. Because on the one hand, the empirical stuff needs good conceptual work to back it and to make sense of the data. And on the other hand, that the theory people, to the extent that they've become totally untethered from reality, are not all that helpful, right? And it's hard. But I do think, to return to Thucydides, he does give us, I think one of his prime virtues is that he's actually working in this space between this. He is both offering a really empirically rigorous account of what happened in the war, but also punctuating his narrative with these moments of decision where various speakers are using theoretical argumentation to try to motivate people to adopt different courses of behavior. And so we get to see the way in which theory both can guide behavior, but also the way in which it can succeed or fail to actually account for reality. And so we're constantly being challenged by Thucydides to think about theory, reality, and the interplay between the two of them. And I think that is in some ways still what we all wish political science looked like, where it was about accounting for the negotiation between theory and reality and sort of productively engaging those two in dialogue rather than siloing ourselves on one side of that divide.
Yeah. So, I mean, to that point, then this moment that Graham Allison takes to be indicative of Thucydides making this grand sort of claim about inevitability of war, what's really happening there if we approach it sort of with all of that background in mind? How should we look at that moment in the text, or what should we think about what Thucydides is really up to?
It's quite hard. I mean, you've asked a very difficult question.
You can put your dissertation on the shelf, please. Let's.
Yeah, as much as I would like to think that my interpretation is an account of what's really happening in the text, it's one of the most controversial moments of the text. And I think a lot of the people who I find most interesting on this read it in a way that it is both a statement about the inevitability of war, but an invitation for the reader to kind of think skeptically about this and question what Thucydides actually means by this. Because one of the bizarre things is he says that war is inevitable, and then he proceeds to show us about 5 moments where people make decisions that lead to war. And according to our kind of social scientific conception of inevitability, you shouldn't be able to choose a different course, right? If something is necessary, truly necessary, if we think of gravity, things fall necessarily, right? If war is necessary, people shouldn't have been able to choose the other course. And so I think what's really productive about the statement is that it actually forces us, in reflecting on what he said and then watching things develop, to develop a slightly more nuanced conception of what necessity is. And it's a much more psychological conception in Thucydides. He has this notion that in politics, necessity is not about the type of deterministic necessity that we have in the natural sciences, but rather it's about a kind of psychological condition in which hypothetically people have choices, but because of who they are and the circumstances they're in, they feel like they don't have a choice, right? And so even though the Spartans could have chosen not to, or the Athenians could have chosen not to go to war, what we're trying to understand is why that wasn't really a choice for them. Why was it that the Athenians, even though they got up on a hill and could have voted no, why they felt compelled to vote yes? And so I think it, like many other moments in the text, by kind of presenting us with something that might look like a bit of a paradoxical situation, kind of forces us to question some of the concepts we use to think about political life, and think a little bit more deeply about what may actually be going on.
And that maybe gets us to sort of we've got a decent amount of time left actually, but the general question of again, sort of from the title, sort of what the use and abuse of ancient texts in modern politics. And one way is to take it as sort of in this idea of the Thucydides Trap, and take it as a sort of direct sort of interlocutor, something to be reckoned with and defeated, and to have some sort of hold on us otherwise, forcing us into war in some ways. I'm curious of what you think, how you think we should begin to think about ancient texts more broadly when it comes to sort of the modern political environment.
Yeah. Well, first I would, I guess, maybe take a step back and say, someone's reaction to this might be, well, why are we even thinking about ancient texts in the first place? It doesn't, it's a false question, right? Because, and the response is, maybe we don't need to be. But the reality is that a lot of people are. And I think perhaps more than we recognize, both people kind of in the upper echelons of the policy making community, but also in really popular movements. So a lot of, especially the far right movements, both here in the US, I'm also quite familiar in the Greek case, have been increasingly turning to the ancient Greeks to offer a sort of model of a pre-liberal way of doing politics, right? That embraces a certain sense of masculinity, a certain glorification of conflict and war. And so in Greece, the Golden Dawn, here the alt-right, have really been returning to these texts. And so how we choose to view them is a kind of a pressing issue that's not just alive in the academic community. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do it. I mean, in part we can turn to the ancients and appreciate them just for their aesthetic value. The Greeks were beautiful writers. Homer, Plato, not so much Aristotle, but Thucydides, they're just a joy to read, and so we can read them for pleasure. I think also on a personal level, it does make sense to mine these texts for things that we might find useful in terms of how we want to live our life. But I would be really skeptical that type of direct appropriation can be effective in communal life and in terms of thinking about how in the 21st century we should be doing politics. Doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can appropriate directly, but rather I think part of what's interesting about the Greeks is that they seem very foreign. On the one hand, they're sort of a constant presence in the background, but when we sit down and look at what the Athenian democracy was like, it really looks nothing like our democracy, and their society looked nothing like our society. It was a slave-holding society where women were pretty severely repressed. It's pre-industrial. The martial culture was incredibly intensive. Religious life was much more active in politics. I think when we burrow down a little bit, it's hard to really recognize ourselves in the Athenians. And yet, the way that we do politics and think about politics is disproportionately derived from the way that they thought and did politics. So even the word politics, the idea that there is this thing called politics, comes from the Greeks. It comes from polis, polis, right, the city, right, and ta politica were the political things, right. So politics is things pertaining to the city, and our words for regimes and some of our conceptions of justice. I mean, these really took root in Greece, and we continue to use these concepts as sort of a basic map for what we're doing when we're doing politics. And so I think part of what we should do, and part of what can be really productive, is to try to negotiate that really messy, complicated relationship and use it as a way to problematize some of the way that we think about politics and complicate what may seem to be obvious about how we do politics. Now, that may seem like a really academic enterprise. It's about us sitting in our armchairs or discussing with friends, and it's hard to distill down into 5 bullet points that we can put on Trump's desk. But in some ways, I think that may be more productive than rushing to find a quotation or a theory that we assume has direct pertinence for the modern world. And I think we actually, to turn this back to Thucydides, get some indication that that's how he hoped his text would be used. I mean, he quite famously, or famous in my weird little world, he quite famously says that he wanted his text to be a katema esae, right, a possession for all time. And so when everyone who sort of reads this suggests, well, he wants us to sort of take this and he wants it to serve as a paradigm for politics. And he even says that as well. He says, so long as human things stay the same, or the human condition stays the same, things are going to play out more or less in the same way. But he also qualifies this to say that, depending on circumstances, they may be more or less the same. And I think what he's showing is that there are these enduring patterns to human life, but those patterns play out in different ways depending on what the particular circumstances are. And I think Thucydides would say, look, human life now is still life made full of humans, and probably some of these patterns are going to be similar, but we have to be really careful about the contingencies and the differences. And we can't be so confident that things were going to happen in exactly the same way.
Yeah, that seems like wise approach.
Yeah. In some ways, it cautions a bit of skepticism, which I think is always a good lesson. But certainly not as sexy as analysis.
It's really interesting to think over the ways in which, we're at, especially as the beginning of this, well, maybe not beginning, but this next presidential election here in the U.S., and there are debates on the left explicitly about the role of, the left and the right in different ways, people in the democratic process, and the way in which these ancient texts are pressing in a variety of ways. It feels striking.
I gave a seminar yesterday here, and we were reading Homer, and it was, talking about the battle between Achilles and Agamemnon at the start of the text. And a student kind of came in and shocked and said, "This sounds like today," sort of as if but it's not supposed to. Somehow we're supposed to have changed dramatic. We got cell phones now. We're different. We're better. And I don't know what's harder. That the thought that we're actually in unprecedented times and doing politics in a way that no one has ever done it before, and so we have no guide, or the thought that the things that make politics dysfunctional right now have always made politics dysfunctional. And it appears that after 2,500 years, we haven't gotten any better at it. I think both are pretty sad, and hopefully there's some middle room between those two that we can strive for to make things a little bit better. But I think these are some of the productive questions that reading the Greeks help kind of thrust upon us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that puzzle, perhaps sad puzzle, I think maybe we should call it. Thank you so much, Mark, for speaking with us. It's really been a pleasure. And for everyone watching, thank you for joining us as well. If you haven't been to our website, please check it out, sempercurious.com. And if you're not already signed up, please sign up for our newsletter. It's the best way to hear about more discussions like these and any events or news we have coming up. We're also on social media, Facebook, and the handle @SemperCurious on Twitter. Mark, I was actually going to ask you if there's anything you want to direct people to about your work or Thucydides, or...
So if you'd like to read more, especially on Thucydides' necessity, I have a academia.edu page you can check out. Otherwise, I'm present on Twitter, but not particularly active. Or come by Georgetown. I teach 4 times a week.
See you there. So thank you. Thank you again, Mark, really. And our next colloquium is September 20th. So if you're watching live, it's 2 weeks from now, and we'll be announcing the speaker very soon. So we hope you enjoyed the discussion and have a great weekend. Take care.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Bye, Mark.